The history of Communist China is shrouded by censorship and propaganda from the Chinese Communist Party. But even the famously obtuse CCP can't hide the legacy of one of its darkest episodes. The Cultural Revolution, which gripped China from 1966 to 1976, remains a topic of great discomfort and regret for many in China, due to the incredible amount of disorder, violence, and death that it caused. Today, on A Day in History, we explore what happened during the Cultural Revolution and why it is so infamous to this day. If you enjoy videos like this, don't forget to drop a like and subscribe to keep up to date with future content. The 1960s were a difficult time for China. Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward had been a catastrophic failure. Mao's agricultural reforms had produced colossal famines that killed tens of millions of people and shattered confidence in his leadership. Although public blame has been deflected to others, Mao was forced to resign as president in 1959, and China pivoted away from his more radical policies under its new president Liu Shaoqi and Party Secretary General Deng Xiaoping. While he wasn't involved in day-to-day governance, Mao was still chairman of the CCP with significant power in the party, and he remained popular with the public. Moreover, Mao was unhappy with the less radical direction of the new leadership and believed that the Communist Revolution was being betrayed by a secret counter-revolutionary element within China. Mao's power base at the time was Shanghai, as opposed to the party administration in Beijing. He had key allies there, namely the Gang of Four, made up of his wife Zhang Qing, the cultural critic Yao Wenwan, the political theorist Zhang Chunchao, and the young but dedicated Wang Hongwen. Another key ally was Mao's right-hand man and presumed successor, Lin Biao. The public scapegoating after the Great Leap Forward had preserved Mao's public image, so he retained huge popular support, especially among the peasants and young people. Additionally, Mao was popular with the military, and with Lin Biao as defense minister, he could count on it as a reliable ally. This combination of grassroots, military, and well-placed elite support would be the key to Mao wresting back control. The flashpoint came from an unusual place, the stage. A play entitled Hai Rui Dismissed from Office told the story of a Ming Dynasty official who was imprisoned for criticizing the emperor when his policies were harming the peasants. Mao and his allies interpreted this as a veiled criticism of his actions during the Great Leap Forward, with Mao as the errant emperor and any number of critical officials as the noble Hai Rui. Some of the CCP establishment opposed Mao's attempts to suppress the play, but this only made them targets. In the heightened political atmosphere of the debate, Mao and his allies managed to outmaneuver their critics and declared them enemies. On May 16, 1966, a decree was issued condemning a number of Mao's key enemies in the party, expelling them from the CCP and outlining Mao's belief that they represented merely a glimpse of the counter-revolutionary elements that remained in China. Mao's message especially appealed to young people. Many had been too young to see the revolution, but had been raised in a culture that constantly spoke about its glories. Mao's declaration was a chance for a new generation to take part in a revolutionary act and satisfy the youthful desire to challenge authority. All across China, students and teenagers formed spontaneous mass movements, known as the Red Guards, taking it upon themselves to root out the counter-revolutionary conspiracy that Mao insisted was all around them. With violence and intimidation, the Red Guards were unleashed first on universities, then on the cities, towns, and party establishment to enforce allegiance to Mao and eliminate anything that they interpreted as counter-revolutionary. Victims were subjected to struggle sessions, where they were forced to confess ideological crimes and declare their allegiance to Maoist thought. Often they were beaten and eventually killed. Perhaps the first person killed by the Red Guards was Miss Bian Zhongyun, deputy principal of Beijing Normal University. On August 5th, legions of her own students publicly beat and humiliated her. They accused her of being a rightist and a counter-revolutionary, accusations that were definitely absurd. After hours of beatings and a humiliating public struggle session, she died of her injuries. She would only be the first. By the end of the month, over 300 people had been killed in schools across China. Almost all of them teachers and staff murdered by their own radicalized students. The attacks spread into the streets. Beijing was gripped by disorder as the Red Guards went house to house, ransacking over 100,000 homes for politically unapproved materials and subjecting residents to beatings and struggle sessions. Lin Biao had publicly declared that the Red Guards should seek to destroy the four olds: old customs, old habits, old culture, and old ideas. This essentially meant that anything that wasn't explicitly communist was worthy of being destroyed. Copies of classic Confucian texts, religious shrines, old poetry, or plays. If the Red Guards found it, you were guilty of crimes against the revolution. The Red Guards were sadistic in their punishment, torturing people in all sorts of cruel ways, from breaking their bones to dousing them in boiling water. In Beijing alone, almost 2,000 people were killed by Red Guards in August and September. Thousands more were beaten or humiliated, which drove many of them to suicide. One famous example of this was the renowned novelist Lao Shi, who was publicly paraded and beaten by Red Guards at the Temple of Confucius in Beijing, causing him to commit suicide days later. One story of a family in Laoyong, Henan province is illustrative. Shi Zhongjun was a minor communist official who was named as an enemy of the revolution by the Red Guards. His family was mistreated and their home was ransacked by the radicals. Eventually, he was beaten and paraded through the streets as a traitor. With no alternative, his own wife denounced him to the crowd, hoping to shield herself and their children from the mob's wrath. Eventually, she was sent off to prison. Back home, one of his daughters was so distraught and humiliated by what the Red Guards did that she took her own life. Xi was one of millions of people with similar stories of suffering and loss as radicalism consumed the country. Some of the worst violence occurred in the rural areas. Between August 26th and September 1st, 1966, in Daxing County in the southern outskirts of Beijing, there was a mass killing of 325 supposed class enemies by activists and local officials. This number included the elderly and babies. Even Mao's power base in Shanghai didn't escape the Red Guards' wrath, with about 500 people killed in the city in a matter of weeks. This spontaneous violence was exactly what Mao wanted. At one rally, Mao's wife Chongqing told the crowds, quote, "If good people beat bad people, it serves them right." Violence was not an unfortunate side effect, but an intentional part of the Cultural Revolution. Mao and his allies used the violence to tighten their political control. A new Cultural Revolution group, CRG, made up of Mao's allies, was set up to provide institutional support to the movement. Meanwhile, the police were ordered to stand down and not intervene in any Red Guard activities. Even the railroads were ordered to give free travel to all Red Guards. The CRG oversaw a mass campaign of suppression for all non-communist ideas, outlawing countless works of art and literature, and even renaming streets across the country to erase all traces of non-communist culture. In October 1966, Mao was in a strong enough position to purge President Shaoqi and Secretary General Xiaoping. Xiaoping would end up in multiple re-education camps, while Shaoqi was thrown in prison until his death 3 years later. Now, Mao and his supporters had to remove the rest of the counter-revolutionaries from around China. 1967 was almost a state of civil war. Across China, Red Guards armed with military equipment overthrew local governments, such as in Shanghai in January 1967. However, the decentralized nature of the Red Guards meant these mini-revolutions were inconsistent and chaotic. Furthermore, the never-ending search for ideological purity among the Red Guards inevitably led to infighting. The worst instance of this came in Wuhan. Two separate Red Guard factions waged a war in the city, both claiming to be the true inheritors of the revolution, while the other was a conservative movement in disguise. The crisis deepened when the local army group, under the leadership of General Chen Zedong, backed one faction, only for Mao to officially back the other. When Mao ordered the army to stand down, they refused. Wuhan was gripped by civil conflict, with armored vehicles and rocket launchers being used in the streets as the crisis dragged on. Eventually, Mao and the army came to an accord, and General Chen Zedong was dismissed for his actions against the Mao-backed revolutionaries. But the Wuhan incident showed Mao that the Red Guards were becoming an issue. Almost every corner of China was gripped by violence. A particularly terrible episode occurred in the Daxian massacre in autumn 1967. Local mobs and army officials in Dao County turned the region into a bloodbath. Thousands were accused of being class enemies and were beaten or killed. There is no evidence of any organized political subversion in the region, and it seems all of it was pure hysteria. Many of the accusations were probably just people trying to settle personal grudges or old family rivalries. It left over 7,000 people dead, many of them children whose families were accused of being class traitors. The estimates for how many died in 1967 vary widely, but some historians put the number into the tens or hundreds of thousands. However, the death toll of the Cultural Revolution would just keep climbing. By 1968, public opinion had soured towards the chaos brought by the Red Guards. After their clashes with the army, it seemed Mao had to choose between his pet radical movement and the established military who were constantly struggling to maintain order. He chose the latter, and did what he had done with the Great Leap Forward. He scapegoated the very people who had done his bidding. Mao declared some of his staunchest allies and the Red Guards themselves as May 16th elements, referencing the date of the decree that had sparked the movement in the first place. These May 16th elements were said to be too radical and had to be removed to restore order. The CRG itself was dissolved and some of its members imprisoned. Meanwhile, the army was permitted to suppress any remaining disorder from the Red Guards. Some Red Guards attempted to resist, but at this point the movement was fizzling out. Most Red Guards dissolved by themselves, and Mao pacified the younger generation by sending many of them to the countryside as part of his Down to the Countryside campaign, hoping to temper their urban radicalism with the hard work of rural life. However, this did not mean that Mao was finished with his revolution. Civil strife was over, but state suppression and targeted violence was the new rule of the day. Mao began a campaign which he dubbed the cleaning of the class ranks, which continued the witch hunt for supposed class enemies. Anyone with connections to old landlords, capitalism, conservatism, right-wing politics, or foreign groups, or accused of these things had to be suppressed. A typical example was seen in Shaoqi County in summer 1968. The local militia and labor groups mobilized the peasants into targeted violence against an imaginary conspiracy of landlords and rightists. Thousands of people were massacred on the flimsiest of accusations. There were so many bodies that they began to dump the corpses into the nearby river. One survivor vividly remembered how their local village resorted to using an old well for water because the tap water was polluted by the bodies floating in the river next to the nearby water purification plant. Similar stories occurred elsewhere. 18,000 people were killed in Guangxi province in 1968. Meanwhile, in Liaoning province, Mao Zedong's nephew led a violent persecution campaign, complete with torture and sexual violence, which killed over 20,000 people. Mao's regime excused the violence by continuing to insist on an elusive anti-communist conspiracy. For example, Maoists in Inner Mongolia fabricated anti-communist rebel groups among the ethnic Mongols to justify the persecution of thousands of the Mongol minority, killing many of them. Meanwhile, in Beijing, an estimated 10,000 people were killed as Mao's regime purged people on the slightest suspicion of anti-communist feeling. Mercifully, the violence decreased into the 1970s and most of the killing was over by 1971. Mao's Cultural Revolution pivoted more towards policy, as the need and appetite for violence decreased. Secure in his power, Mao even allowed some purged officials to return to power, most notably Deng Xiaoping. Some of the actual policies that were part of the Cultural Revolution seem to have been successful. For example, improved education led to a 90% literacy rate by the 1980s, and the Barefoot Doctor program trained almost 2 million rural peasants with basic medical skills for their communities. Internationally, the CCP softened its image and entered a period of improved relations with the West, as it tried to rebuild its reputation after the chaos of the Cultural Revolution's more violent years. However, while the killing declined, it did not stop. Mao was still ordering murder by the hundreds and thousands. In one case from 1975, Mao ordered the extermination of the Muslim village of Sheidan in Yunnan province, killing 1,600 unarmed civilians, including 300 children, members of another imaginary anti-communist conspiracy. Mao finally died on September 9, 1976. Officially, he was mourned as a hero and a treasured thought leader for China. Unofficially, his death finally freed China from his dangerous radicalism. Almost immediately after his death, the CCP turned on Mao's allies. The infamous Gang of Four, who had played a leading role in the Cultural Revolution, were arrested, tortured, and imprisoned. They were blamed for the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, the overthrow of multiple local governments, and the deaths of countless people, although the latter was downplayed. They became the scapegoats that allowed the CCP to distance itself from the atrocities of the revolution. There were also limited efforts to punish others for their actions. Some of the perpetrators of the Daoshan massacre of 1967 were charged, but only a dozen people were sentenced, and none of them received more than 10 years in prison. Mao's nephew, who had led the purges in Liaoning province, was sentenced to 17 years in prison. Hardly enough to account for the thousands who died, but better than nothing. Censorship and a lack of transparency have left historians scrambling to determine the consequences of the Cultural Revolution. The lowest estimates of the death toll from violence between 1966 and 1976 are 500,000, with some as high as 8 million. Most estimates place the death toll somewhere between 1 and 3 million. Millions more were abused, humiliated, or lost loved ones to the violence. The CCP's official line is that the Cultural Revolution was a shameful outburst of violence, caused by rogue radical elements like the Red Guards and Gang of Four. Once again, Mao's public image is protected, and scapegoats are offered to shield him and the party from blame. There is so much we don't know about the Cultural Revolution, and we aren't likely to learn more anytime soon. Earlier, we told the story of Shi Zhongxun, whose daughter was driven to suicide after he was beaten, humiliated, and imprisoned by the Red Guards. You might not know Shi Zhongxun, but you probably know one of his other children, his son, Xi Jinping, President of China. Xi Jinping might have been a victim of the Cultural Revolution, but he is as tight-lipped as anyone. The CCP's official line cannot be compromised, even for someone who saw his own family killed by it. It will be a long time before that silence can be broken, assuming it's ever broken at all. If you appreciated this video, don't forget to like this video. If you want more videos exploring some of the most interesting and complicated events in history, subscribe and turn on notifications to keep up with our future videos.